according to accounts passed down through generations of scholars, there exists a calendar, not an ordinary calendar made to mark harvests or holy feasts, but a calendar sealed, they say, deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, where daylight has never touched certain pages. They speak of an apocalypse calendar, a document that, according to legend, was compiled over centuries to record not what has already happened, but what is still to come. The question that rises before any restless mind is simple, and at the same time devastating. What if the oldest church in the West had already known, for a very long time, when the final veil would tear across the world? In the earliest records that mention something resembling this secret prediction, anonymous monks are said to have copied, by candlelight, fragments that combined prophecies from the book of Daniel with the coded visions of the Apocalypse of John. It is said that these fragments, brought together, formed a sequence, a kind of spiritual countdown, understood by only a few, guarded by even fewer. How could a single text, born of isolated visions on distant islands and forgotten valleys, become something so feared that it had to be locked behind bronze doors? What could possibly be there to justify such institutional silence, upheld across so many generations of guardians? The narrator of this story makes no promise of easy answers. He promises only to guide the viewer through what the records allow us to see, and through what oral tradition, full of shadows and whispers, insists on preserving. Some say that touching this subject is like lighting a candle, where before there was only darkness. Others say it is madness to believe the end could be written in ink and parchment. But the atmosphere surrounding the Vatican has never been made of absolute certainties. It has been made of closed doors, of corridors no one films, of archives that stretch for miles, and whose complete catalog, according to some researchers, has never been made fully public. It is in this uncertain territory, between what is documented and what is whispered, that this journey begins. If this mystery has awakened something in you, stay until the end. The most unsettling fragments of this calendar are still to come, and each one was chosen with care, like someone assembling a mosaic whose full image is only revealed with the very last piece. Over the centuries, theologians debated whether the Apocalypse of John should be read as metaphor or as literal prophecy. That divide was never resolved, and it is precisely in the crack left by that doubt that the legend of the calendar found room to grow. Independent researchers over the past century have claimed to find indirect references to a computus finalis, a kind of final calculation, in old manuscript catalogs, today partially digitized, but whose complete contents, according to them, remain inaccessible to the general public. It must be said honestly, there is no historical proof accepted by traditional historiography that such a calendar exists as a functioning prophetic document. What does exist, undeniably, is a vast collection of medieval manuscripts dealing with eschatology, the theological study of the last things, which, due to their complexity and the coded language typical of the era, have fueled the widest range of interpretations across the centuries. And yet, the question remains suspended in the air, like incense that never quite dissipates. Why were so many of these texts, even though theologically delicate, classified under restricted access for so long? Was it simply institutional caution around sensitive subject matter? Or was there, between the lines, something the Church itself preferred not to let circulate freely? What if some secrets weren't buried to be forgotten, but to be kept alive, waiting for the right moment to be understood? Some also point to a curious detail. The very architecture of the Vatican archives, with their underground corridors stretching for miles, was designed according to official Holy See records, precisely to preserve sensitive documents under conditions of extreme security. That, on its own, proves nothing about prophetic calendars, but it fuels, almost inevitably, the imagination of anyone who knows that in there, among millions of catalogued pages, and just as many still not fully inventoried, almost anything seems possible. Some independent researchers who have devoted decades to the study of medieval eschatology report having come across, in partial catalogues made available to the public, indirect mentions of final compendiums, vague expressions, almost always accompanied by notes suggesting restricted access. None of these accounts has been independently verified by traditional academic historiography. And yet, it is precisely this gray zone, neither confirmation nor categorical denial, that turns a simple rumor into an enduring legend. To understand the origin of this supposed calendar, we must first understand the spiritual ground from which it is said to have sprung. Since the earliest centuries of the Christian faith, the idea of the end of days was never just a distant theological topic. It was, for countless generations, a living presence, almost tangible, that shaped how entire communities saw the world around them. Fear of the end and hope for redemption have always walked hand in hand, like two faces of the same spiritual coin. Wherever there was war, famine, or plague, there were also those who searched the heavens and the scriptures for signs that human time was running out. That relentless search for meaning in the face of suffering is, perhaps, the true origin of everything we now call apocalyptic prophecy. The first copyists who devoted themselves to preserving these visions were not simple mechanical scribes. They were men, and, in some lesser-known records, also women in contemplative orders who spent their entire lives deciphering symbols. Beasts with 7 heads, seals that open one by one, horsemen bearing names like famine, plague, war, and death. Each symbol was treated not as literary fiction, but as sacred code, a language God was believed to have used to hide truths too terrible to be spoken directly. It was in this atmosphere of reverence and reverent terror that the habit of cataloging, comparing, and cross-referencing interpretations was born. Entire monasteries devoted their own libraries to this single purpose, gathering everything ever written about the end of days in hopes of finding, among so many conflicting voices, a pattern, a sequence, an answer. It is precisely at this point that the legend of the calendar takes clearer shape. It is said that as the See of Rome centralized ecclesiastical power, these scattered collections were gradually brought under its custody, not by chance. To control the interpretation of the end of days meant in a sense controlling the hope and the fear of millions of believers. Every layer that's uncovered brings another shadow with it. Keep watching. The veil hasn't fully lifted yet. Some contemporary scholars, analyzing partially available records from the Vatican Apostolic Library, point out that certain medieval manuscripts carry marginal notes made by different hands in different eras, as though the same text had been revisited, generation after generation, by readers seeking to update calculations and interpretations in light of the events of their own time. For many, this pattern of continuous rereading is the true root of the idea of a living calendar. Not a static document, but something reinterpreted and adjusted across the centuries. It bears repeating. There is no accepted documentary proof that these notes actually form a coherent prophetic system. What does exist is an undeniable pattern of institutional fascination with the subject, a fascination that, for believers in the theory, would be reason enough to justify the secrecy, and that, for skeptics, is simply the natural reflection of how important eschatology has always been within Catholic tradition. Between faith and fear, silence has become a third force, every bit as powerful as the other two. A silence that neither denies nor confirms, that only watches, and in watching, feeds even further the curiosity of anyone seeking to understand what lies behind the oldest walls of Western Christendom. It's important to understand that this cataloging impulse was not born of a single moment, but of a slow, almost geological process of accumulation. Every pope, every librarian, every archivist who passed through the halls of the Holy See across the centuries left his own mark on how these collections were organized, reclassifying, reorganizing, at times temporarily concealing whatever he judged too sensitive for the historical moment he lived in. For historians, this constant reshuffling is proof of administrative diligence. For conspiracy theorists, it's proof that somewhere along the way, something had to be deliberately hidden from specific eyes. It's also worth remembering that the very notion of a Vatican secret carries a symbolic weight that goes far beyond any actual document. For centuries, the mere existence of an archive closed to the public was enough to spawn entire mythologies, many of them with no connection at all to the real contents of the preserved documents. In that sense, the mystery is born not only from the texts themselves, but from the very idea that there are texts most of us will never be allowed to read. It is that void of information, more than any concrete revelation, that has fueled the popular imagination for generations about what the Church might be hiding about the end of days. Add to this the symbolic role played by Jerusalem and Rome as two geographic and spiritual poles of this same narrative. Jerusalem, birthplace of John's original visions and setting of Daniel's prophecies, represents the raw, direct origin of revelation. Rome, in turn, represents the systematization, the institutional organization of what had once been individual mystical experience. Between these two poles, the prophetic ecstasy of the desert and the sacred bureaucracy of the archives unfolds all the tension that still sustains, to this day, the fascination with any theory involving hidden documents about the end of days. If there is a core of evidence around which the legend of the apocalypse calendar is built, it doesn't lie in a single, spectacular document, but in a mosaic of scattered fragments, each one too small on its own to prove anything, yet large enough, together, to sustain decades of speculation. The first of these fragments is biblical in nature and therefore public, accessible to anyone willing to open the pages of the book of Daniel. In it, visions of beasts, kingdoms, and symbolic numbers, like the famous 70 weeks, have been interpreted across the centuries as a kind of prophetic clock embedded in Scripture. Medieval theologians devoted entire treatises to trying to calculate, from these numbers, approximate dates for future events. The second fragment comes from the Apocalypse of John itself, whose dense symbolism, the 4 horsemen, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, The beast and its number works almost like a mathematical riddle disguised as mystical vision. Scholars who have studied the Christian eschatological tradition describe this text as a deeply coded work, written amid persecution, where symbolic language also served as protection against Roman imperial repression. The third fragment is more delicate, and it is precisely the one that feeds the myth of the secret calendar. Never officially confirmed accounts from researchers who claim to have had limited access to catalogs of the Vatican Apostolic Archive and who mention the existence of medieval compilations devoted exclusively to cross-referencing these two prophetic sources, Daniel and Revelation, with historical events already known to have occurred in an attempt to calibrate the symbolic system and, from it, project future dates. Tell us in the comments what your gut is telling you. Is it faith or is it fear? The deepest answers usually come from silence. There are also the so-called traveling manuscripts, texts that, according to accounts from medieval historians, circulated among monasteries in different regions of Europe, being copied, annotated, and returned in a slow process that could span generations. In that process, it is plausible, and here we step into the territory of inference, not proven fact, that divergent interpretations were gradually unified into more official versions, possibly preserved with greater care precisely because of their multiple origins and their supposed convergence of signs. What strikes independent researchers isn't just the content of these texts, but the pattern of secrecy surrounding them. While much of the medieval theological collection was, over the centuries, gradually open to scholars and the public, certain categories of eschatological manuscripts remained under restricted classification for far longer. For believers in the calendar theory, that differential treatment is in itself a signal. For more skeptical historians, it is simply institutional caution around sensitive texts, whose public misinterpretation could spark panic or organized heresies, something the Church, throughout its history, has always treated with extreme caution. If the truth touches the unseen, leave a sign of light, a quiet gesture, but a powerful one. And yet, even in the absence of definitive proof, an even greater mystery looms on the horizon. If no formal prophetic calendar exists, why do so many witnesses, across so many decades, keep describing the same sensation when this subject comes up? The feeling of touching something the institution itself would rather keep out of the light. Historians such as Bart Ehrman and Elaine Pagels, in analyzing the Christian eschatological tradition in their academic work, describe the Apocalypse of John not as a literal mathematical riddle, but as a deeply political text for its time, a coded critique of Roman imperial power, disguised as mystical vision to escape censorship. Under that reading, the numbers and symbols that fuel so many secret calendar theories would originally have served a far more immediate purpose than forecasting distant dates, protecting a persecuted community, offering it hope encoded in a language only the initiated would fully understand. That academic interpretation doesn't cancel out the popular fascination with the subject. It simply shifts it, because even if the original purpose of these texts was something else, nothing stops successive generations of readers across the centuries that followed from reinterpreting those same words in light of their own urgencies, finding in them again and again echoes of their own catastrophes. It is that process of continuous rereading, more than any single document, that gives shape to the legend of a calendar that updates itself century after century. Add to this a detail often forgotten. The very concept of a secret archive underwent in the Church's recent history an official change of name. What, for centuries, was called the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum came in more recent times to be called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, a change the Holy See itself publicly described as an effort to clarify that the word secret in ecclesiastical Latin always meant private or personal, not necessarily hidden in the conspiratorial sense popular culture came to attach to the word. Even so, for the popular imagination, that semantic distinction mattered little. The old name had already crystallized generations earlier as the ultimate symbol of institutional mystery, and no change of name could fully erase that association. Every mystery bound up with faith carries at its core a conflict that cannot be resolved by weapons or by decrees. The battle between the belief that comforts and the doubt that corrodes. It is exactly in that invisible territory that the legend of the Apocalypse calendar finds its truest battlefield. Not in the stone archives of the Vatican, but in the conscience of every person who hears this story and wonders what they would do if they truly knew when it would all end. Throughout the Church's history, entire movements were born and died around this same tension. Groups claiming to hold revelations about the end of days emerged again and again, repeatedly branded by the ecclesiastical hierarchy as millenarian heresies. The Church, consistently across the centuries, adopted a cautious stance toward specific predictions about the apocalypse, avoiding the validation of exact dates, a stance that, for theorists of the secret calendar, would be a smokescreen, and that, for official theology, simply reflects a doctrine that has always discouraged any literal calculation of dates for events the Scriptures themselves describe as unknowable to men. That clash between doctrinal transparency and archival secrecy is the true spiritual heart of this story. On one side, an institution that publicly preaches the uncertainty of the day and the hour. On the other, archives that, according to some accounts, hold precisely what official doctrine claims is impossible to know. Is this contradiction merely apparent? The result of the difference between pastoral faith and internal academic curiosity? Or is there, in fact, a chasm between what is taught from the pulpit and what is preserved in the vaults? Anyone still with us carries the weight of this revelation. Which side of the veil would you choose, belief or forgetting? This struggle isn't fought only within the walls of the Vatican. It plays out quietly inside every viewer watching this story unfold. There is, in every human being, an ancient desire to know, and, at the same time, an even more ancient fear of finding out. That paradox is the engine that has, for centuries, driven both faith and heresy, both devotion and rebellion against institutional silence. Historically, whenever a group insisted publicly on claiming privileged knowledge about the end of days, two things tended to happen: the immediate draw of crowds hungry for certainty, and an institutional response almost always marked by investigations, condemnations, or, in the most serious cases, excommunications. This well-documented historical pattern reinforces, paradoxically, both sides of the theory. It shows that the Church truly treats this subject with extreme rigor, which can be read either as pastoral prudence or as deliberate control of information. That same pattern repeated itself, with variations, at different moments in European history, in medieval millenarian movements, in traveling preachers of the modern era, and even in contemporary currents that reinterpret recent global events as the literal fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The Church's institutional response throughout all these episodes has remained remarkably consistent, reaffirming the uncertainty of the day and the hour, while acknowledging, without denying, the theological legitimacy of eschatological expectation as a central part of the Christian faith. Subscribe and walk with us. Every new video is a key, and every key opens another seal. In the end, perhaps the true invisible struggle isn't between the Vatican and its secrets, but between the human need to control the uncontrollable and the humility, so hard to hold on to, of accepting that certain answers may never be given in this life. It is in that uncertain space, between faith that accepts mystery and intellect that insists on decoding it, that this documentary continues its journey. It's worth remembering that the Catechism of the Catholic Church itself treats eschatology with deliberate caution, stating that the exact moment of the end is known only to God, and explicitly rejecting any attempt at precise human calculation of that event. That doctrinal stance, maintained consistently across the centuries, can be read in two opposing and equally valid ways within this story: as a sincere expression of theological humility before divine mystery, or as an institutional barrier carefully built to discourage any public speculation that might destabilize the Church's own authority over the interpretation of Scripture. It is in that ambiguity, never fully resolved, perhaps never resolvable, that the true emotional force of this legend resides. Because unlike a simple conspiracy theory that could be debunked by a single revealed document, the mystery of the Apocalypse calendar survives precisely because it touches something no documentary proof will ever be able to fully settle: humanity's own uncertainty in the face of the end. There comes a moment in any investigation into the sacred when rational language is no longer enough, and one must turn to the senses to draw closer to what escapes words. Picture, for a moment, the particular silence of a deeply old archive room, the smell of aged leather, of paper that has withstood centuries of carefully controlled humidity, the almost imperceptible sound of pages no one dares turn too quickly. It is in this sensory environment, real in the archives that exist, symbolic in what the legend describes, that the supposed core of the Apocalypse calendar is said to lie. Unconfirmed accounts speak of a specific room, with access extremely restricted even among authorized scholars, where eschatological manuscripts are said to have been gathered and organized according to a system that, outside a very small circle, no one has ever fully understood. The light, in these accounts, is always described as scarce, not for dramatic effect, but out of genuine conservation need. Manuscripts this old require strict control of light and humidity, which naturally lends these spaces an atmosphere of perpetual, almost liturgical dimness. Anyone who has visited the restricted sections of major historical archives describes a similar feeling. Time seems to compress, as though the past were breathing closer than it should. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this ritual. Simply watching is a form of participation. Conservation documents published by the Vatican Apostolic Library itself describe, in rich technical detail, the extreme care given to parchment manuscripts over 1,000 years old. strict temperature control, relative humidity kept within razor-thin margins, specialized lighting that prevents the degradation of the iron gall ink used by medieval copyists. It is within this real, scientifically documented environment that the popular imagination projects its most dramatic version, turning conservation rooms into chambers of secrets, and archivists dedicated to historical preservation into silent guardians of forbidden truths. At this point in the narrative, it's important to clearly separate what can be stated as fact from what belongs to the realm of mystical speculation. It is historically accurate to say that the Vatican holds one of the largest and oldest documentary collections in the Western world, including thousands of manuscripts related to Christian eschatology. It is also accurate to say that a significant portion of that collection remained, for reasons of conservation and institutional policy, outside public access for long periods. What cannot be stated, based on accepted historical evidence, is that a single, coherent, literally calculated document exists, pointing to specific dates for the end of the world. And yet, the symbolic power of the idea remains fully intact, because even without a physical calendar, the Church has built over 2,000 years something that functions almost like a collective spiritual calendar, a system of signs, symbols, and interpretations that each generation revisits in light of its own crises: wars, pandemics, climate collapse, social upheaval, always asking whether this, finally, would be the ultimate sign. Leave your sign in the comments. That's how silence becomes community. Perhaps the true hidden ritual isn't concealed in any secret room at all, but in the very act of interpreting. Every time a theologian, a historian, or an ordinary believer reads the Apocalypse of John and tries to find in it a reflection of the present, that ritual repeats itself, silent, intimate, almost invisible to anyone watching from outside. And it is precisely that ritual, repeated by millions across the centuries, that gives the legend of the secret calendar its nearly unshakable power. Not because a proven document exists, but because the human need to decipher the end is, itself, a real, documented, and deeply human phenomenon. Consider, for a moment, how many times humanity has already believed itself to be facing the end. Plagues that wiped out entire populations, wars that seemed to have no limit, eclipses and comets read as definitive signs. Each of these eras produced its own interpreters, its own calculations, its own certainty that time was running out. None of them, to this day, has been proven true, and yet each following generation insists on restarting the same calculation, as if humanity's collective memory repeatedly chose to forget its own previous false alarms in the name of the present moment's urgency. This pattern, repeated throughout history, doesn't invalidate the search. It only reveals its deeper nature. Perhaps it was never about finding the exact date, but about keeping watchfulness alive, the state of spiritual alertness that keeps complacency at bay in the face of the world's suffering. In that sense, the Apocalypse calendar, whether or not it physically exists in some secret archive, has already fulfilled its symbolic function for 2,000 years, keeping humanity in a state of listening. And perhaps that is exactly the hidden revelation this episode set out, from the very beginning, to bring you: not a date, not a document, not an irrefutable proof locked behind bronze doors, but the quiet reminder that waiting, in itself, is already a form of faith. As long as someone keeps asking when, and as long as someone keeps reading the signs of the times with attention and reverence, the true apocalypse calendar will keep being written, day after day, in the collective conscience of all humanity. Having come this far in the journey, perhaps the most honest question isn't, does the Vatican hold a secret apocalypse calendar? But rather, why does that possibility fascinate us so much? The answer, contrary to what one might expect, isn't locked away in any archive in Rome. It lies in every viewer who, at this very moment, feels the familiar weight of that question echo inside them. There is no historical proof accepted by traditional historiography that the Vatican holds a single, literal document capable of predicting the exact day of the end of days. What does exist, undeniably and thoroughly documented, is a vast legacy of eschatological texts, divergent theological interpretations, and a consistent institutional pattern of extreme caution around any specific apocalyptic prediction, a caution that, ironically, has fueled for centuries exactly the kind of speculation it tried to prevent. The true apocalypse calendar, if it exists anywhere at all, may not be written on any parchment. Perhaps it lies in the way every human generation, faced with its own catastrophes and uncertainties, keeps searching the heavens and the ancient scriptures for meaning in the chaos it lives through. In that sense, the true secret doesn't belong to the Vatican. It belongs to every person who has ever looked at a world in ruins and wondered whether that finally was the beginning of the end. The journey continues. Subscribe and follow along with us. Every new episode is a flame lit in the dark. Faith, history, and mystery remain, as they always have, inseparably intertwined. And perhaps it is exactly that blend, never fully resolved, never fully explained, that keeps alive, century after century, the fascination with everything the Vatican holds in silence. Not because that silence necessarily hides a literal truth about the end of days, but because silence itself is already a powerful form of language, perhaps the oldest of all sacred languages. Write in the comments what silence told you today. Sometimes that's where the truth reveals itself. And what if, in the end, the true calendar isn't kept behind bronze doors at all, but inside every conscience that keeps asking, when? That question, with no definitive answer, is the true legacy this mystery leaves behind. A quiet invitation for every viewer to keep watching, keep questioning, and keep coming back, episode after episode, to the deepest shadows the Vatican still holds. Because some seals, as they've said since the earliest times, only open for those willing to stay until the end. In the next episode of this journey, the veil will lift on another forgotten chapter of the Church's hidden history, another fragment of the vast mosaic that makes up Rome's never fully revealed secrets. Until then, may the silence that has settled over you today keep echoing, like a distant bell no one else dares to ring, but that everyone, somewhere in their soul, can still hear.